Picture the pyramids. Go ahead, close your eyes for a second and let the image form. The great triangles rising from the sand at Giza, the Sphinx crouching in the haze, the Nile glittering in the distance. That image is so complete, so iconic, that it almost feels like Egypt simply appeared one morning fully formed, as though the desert just decided one day to grow monuments. Pharaohs, hieroglyphs, gold death masks, embalmed cats. The whole spectacle seems to arrive out of nowhere around 3000 BCE and then just keeps going for 3000 years, which is staggering enough on its own. But here's what that image hides. It hides everything that came before. And what came before is one of the most fascinating and underappreciated puzzles in all of human history. Because Egypt didn't just appear. No civilization ever does. Beneath the pyramids, beneath the dynasties, beneath the first pharaoh and the first hieroglyph, there are centuries and centuries of something else, something older. Something that was building toward that famous moment for longer than most people realize, and something that, in certain important ways, has been quietly erased from the popular story. The central question this video wants to sit with is this. Was there a fully developed Nile civilization, a complex, culturally rich society, living and building and believing things along this river long before pharaonic Egypt crystallized into the form we recognize? The evidence suggests the answer is yes, though the details are fragmentary, contested, and endlessly interesting. We're going to look at what survived. Ancient graves filled with objects that shouldn't exist that early. Pottery painted with boats and crocodiles and figures that look almost ceremonial. Settlements that appear, flourish, and then seem to vanish into the archaeological record. Rock art carved into cliffs far from the Nile. And climate data that suggest the landscape itself was radically different, shaped by rainfall patterns and a green geography that would be unrecognizable today. This isn't a story about a lost empire waiting to be discovered whole. It's something more honest and more interesting than that. It's a story of partial survival and partial erasure, of how a civilization can be buried, not just by sand, but by the very culture that grew out of it. Before we go any further, I'm genuinely curious where you're watching this from right now. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. I always read them, and there's something quietly wonderful about knowing this reaches people in so many different corners of the world. To understand what came before the dynasties, you have to do something that feels almost counterintuitive. You have to forget the desert, not just push it to the background, actually erase it from your mental image. Because the Egypt we think we know, that vast sun-baked landscape where sand meets sky at every horizon, is a geologically recent invention. And before it arrived, something remarkable was happening across North Africa that set in motion everything that followed. Go back roughly 10,000 years. The Sahara, today the largest hot desert on Earth, was green. Not in patches, not in isolated oases clinging to underground water. Broadly, genuinely, abundantly green. Scientists call this the African humid period, sometimes the Green Sahara, and the evidence for it is extraordinary. Lake sediments in places that haven't seen standing water in millennia. Fossilized riverbeds threading through terrain that now receives almost no rainfall. Pollen records showing savanna grasses and shrubs and trees across regions that are now just rock and dune. Cave paintings in places like the Tassili Naja Plateau in Algeria. Deep in what is now barren desert, showing cattle herds, swimming figures, hippos, crocodiles, animals that need water, lots of it. The mechanism driving all this was a shift in the Earth's orbital tilt that strengthened the African monsoon. Summer rains pushed further north than they do today, watering landscapes that had been dry for thousands of years before that. The result was a North Africa that could actually support people, not just barely, but comfortably. Grasslands that drew grazing animals, lakes that supplied fish, seasonal rains that made the growing of early crops conceivable. For thousands of years, human groups ranged across this territory in ways that would be completely impossible today. Think about what that means for the story of Egypt specifically. The people who eventually converged on the Nile Valley didn't come from nowhere. Many of them came from across this wider, wetter, more hospitable landscape. They were moving, herding, hunting, following the rhythms of rain and grass and animal migration across a territory that bore no resemblance to the world we see there now. They had been building knowledge and culture and social networks for generations before the desert closed in around them. And then, gradually, it did close in. Starting around 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, the monsoon began its slow retreat. The orbital shift that had watered the Sahara reversed course, and the rains pulled back southward. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't a single catastrophic moment. It was centuries of slow drying, lakes shrinking, grass giving way to scrub, scrub giving way to bare earth. The process accelerated somewhere around 5,000 years ago, roughly when the archaeological record in Egypt suddenly gets much busier and much more interesting, because here is where environmental pressure becomes historical force. As the habitable zones contracted, people had to go somewhere, and across the vast territory that was drying out, one landscape remained reliably, extraordinarily productive: the Nile Valley. Not just the river itself, but the flood corridor along its banks, where annual inundations deposited rich silt and kept the soil dark and alive even as the surrounding desert baked. This wasn't just water, it was a linear oasis running roughly the length of a continent, offering predictable, renewable fertility in a region that was otherwise becoming increasingly hostile to human life. Groups that had been spread across the grasslands for thousands of years began funneling toward that corridor. Not all at once, not in any organized migration, but gradually, generation by generation, as the lands their ancestors had roamed became harder and harder to live in. The Nile didn't draw them in because it was uniquely inviting. It drew them in because everything else was leaving. What happens when you concentrate people into a narrow corridor? You get interaction, trade, cooperation, competition, conflict. You get the conditions under which social complexity tends to accelerate. When populations are spread thin across generous landscapes, the pressure to organize, to hierarchize, to develop the kind of institutional structures that manage large groups of people, that pressure is relatively low. But when people are crowded together along a single river, sharing limited floodplains, competing for the most productive land, negotiating access to water and grazing rights and fishing grounds, something starts to change. Societies begin to develop mechanisms for managing that density, leadership structures, ways of marking territory, ways of storing and exchanging surplus, ways of distinguishing who belongs where and who owes what to whom. This is not a guarantee. Not every crowded river valley became ancient Egypt. But the conditions created by that long, slow migration, that funneling of diverse populations into a shared corridor, created the pressure that made complexity not just possible, but probably necessary. There's one more thing worth noting here, and it matters for the rest of this story. The desert that drove people toward the Nile also became, over time, one of the most efficient erasure machines on Earth. Not because it destroys everything. In fact, dry conditions preserve certain things remarkably well, but because it buried and isolated and made inaccessible the landscapes where earlier societies had lived and moved. The lake beds, the seasonal campsites, the middens and hearths and shelters of the people who spent millennia in the Green Sahara before it vanished. Much of that is now buried under dunes, or bleached beyond recognition under open sky far from any living archaeologist's regular survey route. The desert didn't just reshape where people lived. It helped hide the evidence that they had lived there at all, and that hiding, it turns out, is part of how a civilization gets erased before it ever gets a chance to be remembered. Picture the Nile Valley now, not as a tourist brochure with a ribbon of green pinned between beige deserts, but as a place newly crowded with possibilities. You have people arriving from drying grasslands to the west, from the Levant to the northeast, from older communities already hugging parts of the river. Some come with herds, some with seeds saved from seasons of experimental planting near shrinking lakes. Some with nothing but their knowledge of wild plants and animals and the stories that encode that knowledge. They don't think of themselves as Egyptians. That word doesn't exist yet. What exists are small groups looking for reliable land, water, and room to breathe. At first, they don't build Egypt. They build camps, low clusters of huts made from reeds and mud on slightly raised ground, just above where the flood usually reaches. Simple storage pits for grain, tethering posts for goats and cattle, hearths blackened from repeated use. If you walked through one of these early communities in Upper Egypt, somewhere around what we now call Middle Egypt to Aswan, you wouldn't see monuments. You'd see people learning the river's moods. How high does the water come in a good year? Where does it cut new channels that might threaten your houses? Which patches of silted ground hold moisture longest after the flood, making them perfect for planting emmer wheat and barley? These are not abstract questions. Get them wrong, and you lose your crop, your seed stock, maybe your entire reason for being here. By around 4,500 BCE, in the stretch of Upper Egypt near modern-day Badari, the experiment has become something more stable. Archaeologists call what they see in the ground here the Badarian culture. The people who lived it didn't use that name, of course. For them, this is simply the world. You wake up before sunrise in a Badarian village. The air is cool, smoke hangs low over the settlement. The narrow lanes between houses are packed earth, trampled by bare feet and animal hooves. You can hear the snuffling of cattle in pens at the edge of the village, goats complaining as they're untied, a baby crying somewhere, then quieting as someone lifts and rocks them. Your house is simple, wattle and daub walls, a roof of reeds and brush, but the objects inside tell a more complicated story. There's a finely made stone knife with a blade so thin it looks almost sharp enough to slice light, a polished pear-shaped pot with a smooth red surface and a darker, almost black rim, the result of a firing technique that someone in your community has mastered through trial, error, and years of practice. Beads of bone, shell, and a glossy green stone that isn't from here at all. When you die, those objects, or things like them, might go with you. Badarian burials are some of our clearest windows into these early Nile communities. Bodies are laid in shallow graves, often on their left side, knees drawn up, facing roughly toward the Nile, or the rising sun. They're wrapped in mats or animal skins. Around them, people place pottery, tools, ornaments. Sometimes a finely polished stone mace head, sometimes a cosmetic palette, a small flat slab used for grinding pigments. Sometimes nothing more than a simple pot and a few personal items. From a modern perspective, this looks humble. From an archaeological perspective, it's loaded. Not everyone gets the same treatment. Some graves are richer, with more objects, better-made pots, finer stone tools, more elaborate beads. Others are sparse. In that difference, you can see the faint outline of status. Certain families or individuals had access to more or better, or both. They might have controlled the best fields, or the most cattle, or specialized skills that the community depended on. Whatever the specifics, you're looking at a society where social roles are no longer flat and interchangeable. A hierarchy, still modest, is emerging. The grave goods themselves hint at beliefs. Nobody buries you with a beautiful pot unless they think, on some level, that it still matters to you, that you will, in some sense, continue. The exact shape of Badarian ideas about the afterlife is lost to us, but the gesture is unmistakable. Death is a transition, not an absolute end. That idea will eventually be wrapped in complex theology, spells, and monumental tombs. Here, it's just a body, a mat, a pot, a few cherished objects, and the care of those who place them. Meanwhile, back in the living village, life is getting more organized. You're no longer in a band where everyone does a bit of everything. Certain people have become very good at particular things, and that competence is starting to reshape daily life. There's the napper who can turn raw stone into blades, drills, and delicate projectile points faster and more reliably than anyone else. The potter whose vessels don't crack in the fire, and whose surfaces have that distinctive red shine people recognize from far away. The person who works bone and ivory into needles, hairpins, and tiny figurines. This is craft specialization, and it's subtle but powerful. When some people spend more time making tools and containers than growing food, something else has to be true in the background. There is enough surplus that the group can afford it. Maybe your harvests, with the help of the flood, are consistently better than you need for immediate survival. Maybe your herds are large enough that you can slaughter animals occasionally without panic. Either way, food storage and predictable productivity are allowing labour to diversify. Specialists produce objects that quickly become markers of identity and status. A particular style of pot tells you where someone comes from. A specific kind of bead or cosmetic palette might signal adulthood, or marriage, or membership in a particular lineage. Culture is thickening, and it doesn't thicken in isolation. Mixed in with the everyday materials of Badarian and other early Nile sites are things that don't belong geologically. Obsidian, volcanic glass so sharp it can split a hair, isn't local to the Nile Valley. It likely travelled hundreds of miles, probably from the Red Sea hills, or even further afield in the Horn of Africa. Shells turn up from the Red Sea and possibly the Mediterranean. There are blue-green stones and glazed beads that, while not true Afghan lapis, imitate its colour, suggesting both an awareness of exotic materials and a desire to copy their appearance. Each foreign object is a breadcrumb on a trade route. You can imagine how it worked, not as caravans marching from ocean to river in a single heroic effort, but as networks of short-range exchanges. A group near the Red Sea trades shells inland for good quality flint or livestock. Those shells move one community further, then another, eventually reaching a village on the Nile where no one has ever seen the ocean, but everyone knows that these curved, spiraled things are special. In return, Nile villagers send grain, dried fish, worked tools, or attractive pots upstream and downstream. Over generations, this creates something that's not yet a state, but is more than isolated hamlets. It's a corridor of communities connected by goods, marriages, stories, and shared expectations. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, even at this stage, are not identical worlds. The delta in the north is marshier, with multiple branches of the river spreading into lagoons and wetlands. People there lean heavily on fishing, fowling, and plant resources suited to that watery maze. In the south, the valley is narrower, the floodplain more clearly bounded by cliffs. Here, farming and herding weave more tightly together. Yet, when you compare the material culture, the pots, the tools, the way the dead are arranged, you start to see family resemblances. Certain vessel shapes recur. Certain ways of treating the dead echo up and down the river. Certain motifs, simple ones at first, like particular ways of decorating a rim or carving a figurine, start to spread. You can almost feel an emerging sense that people, along this long, sinuous lifeline, are part of something shared, even if they couldn't define it and certainly don't yet govern it from a single centre. Language is evolving. Maybe several related dialects are coexisting. Myths are taking shape, anchored in the rhythm of the flood, the behaviour of cattle, the path of the sun across a sky that now matters deeply for planting and harvesting. People are beginning to think in terms of fields and boundaries, of seasons measured not just by rain, but by the river's pulse. The foundations of what we'll later call Egyptian identity are already there, in embryo. Respect for the fertile black earth of the floodplain, attention to cycles of inundation and emergence, the idea that death requires careful ritual, the sense that crafted objects can carry meaning beyond their practical use, the habit of looking beyond your immediate village to others up and down the river, linked by trade and sometimes by competition. But there is still no pharaoh, no notion of a single ruler stretching their authority from delta to cataracts. Power is local. Loyalties are to households, villages, small chiefdoms at most. The story is still a mosaic of many communities, not yet the unified picture painted on the walls of later temples. That unification, when it comes, will draw heavily on patterns already established in places like Badari and its neighbours. And before that, in another key region upriver, a new force is about to emerge, one that will push this growing complexity to a different scale entirely. Follow the Nile further south, into a stretch of Upper Egypt that later scribes will remember as a cradle of kingship, but that, right now, is just another cluster of river villages learning how to live with abundance. By around 4000 BCE, people here are doing many of the same things as their Badarian neighbours upstream and down, tending fields, herding cattle, shaping pots, burying their dead with care. But if you zoom in on the details, something is changing. The pace of change itself is speeding up. Archaeologists give this unfolding story 3 labels, Naqada 1, 2 and 3, To the people living through it, it's just life, seasons, floods, marriages, feuds. Yet across these centuries, the texture of that life shifts from village-scale cooperation to something sharper, more unequal, more political. Start with something as humble as a pot. In the earliest Naqada I phase, pottery is still mostly functional. Red and brown wares, some with that polished black rim inherited from Badarian techniques. They're good pots, well made, but they don't shout. As time passes into Naqada II, the vessels begin to change. Shapes multiply. You see tall, slender jars with flaring necks, bowls with neatly averted rims, bottles with elegant curves. Surfaces are painted with new motifs. Boats with multiple cabins, rows of people with upraised arms, standards topped with animals or emblems. These are not casual doodles. They're iconography, the beginnings of a visual language that will later blossom into hieroglyphs and temple scenes. Someone is deciding that certain images belong on the finest pots. Someone has the authority to say, this is what matters. At the same time, you start noticing objects that are never meant to stir porridge or carry water. Carved stone vases so heavy they're useless for daily chores, but perfect for standing impressively in a shrine. Cosmetic palettes that once were simple ovals of stone now stretch into shields, animals, abstract shapes. Some are incised with hunting scenes, processions, or hybrid creatures that may already be early forms of the gods, will later meet fully formed in dynastic Egypt. These ceremonial objects concentrate in particular graves, and that's where the story of complexity becomes impossible to ignore. In Naqada I, burials are modest variations on a theme. A mat or simple coffin, a few pots, perhaps a piece of jewellery. By Naqada II, especially in certain cemeteries, you start seeing outliers. Tombs larger and deeper than their neighbours, packed with dozens of vessels, fine flint knives, decorated palettes, stone mace heads, ivory combs and figurines. The body in the pit is not just another villager. In death, they occupy more space, consume more labour, command more symbolic weight. Inequality has stopped whispering and started speaking plainly. Now shift your gaze from a single cemetery to the wider landscape. Along this stretch of river, a few places begin to stand out. Hierakonpolis, Naqada itself, Abydos further north. What were once just big villages are turning into regional centres. There are more houses, more storage facilities, more specialised workshops, evidence of large-scale beer, brewing and feasting. Animal enclosures on a scale that suggests not just household herds, but controlled wealth. These centres don't exist in polite isolation. Their material cultures, the style of their pots, the forms of their prestige objects, the way they bury their elites, start to radiate outward, showing up in smaller surrounding communities. It looks like influence, maybe even control. If you live in a hamlet near Hierakonpolis, your best grave goods might mimic what the big people in the regional hub are using. Maybe by choice, maybe by pressure. Competition leaves darker traces too. In layers dating to late Naqada II and Naqada III, you find burned structures, signs of sudden destruction, skeletons with trauma that doesn't come from farming accidents. At Hierakonpolis, there's a famous painted tomb where rows of bound captives are shown under the feet of larger, armed figures and boats bristling with standards. Elsewhere, mace heads and knife handles bear tiny scenes of domination. A powerful figure smiting a kneeling enemy, animals trampling other animals, rows of defeated foes. These are not gentle images. They're political messages. Someone is saying, leadership here doesn't just mean organising irrigation or hosting feasts. It means command in war, victory over rivals, the right to take life. At the same time, ritual is tightening its grip on power. The largest Naqada period tombs are not just pits stuffed with goods. They're carefully planned spaces, sometimes partitioned, sometimes lined, sometimes accompanied by separate little graves for animals, dogs, cattle, even baboons, that may have been companions, offerings, or status symbols. The person in the centre is being framed not merely as a rich villager, but as a figure whose death requires choreography, special objects, special animals, possibly special words and actions that never fossilized, but whose traces we can feel in the arrangement. By Naqada III, in places like Abydos, tombs associated with particular leaders begin to be surrounded by subsidiary burials, dozens of people interred alongside or just after the main burial. Were these retainers sacrificed to follow their leader into the next world? Seasonal workers who died in service? The exact scenario is debated, but the implication is chilling either way. Individual lives are being folded into the story of a single powerful person. This is what proto-state formation looks like in the archaeological record. You have regional centers expanding their reach, possibly through alliances, marriages and trade, but also through raids and conquest. You have leaders who are no longer just the rich guy or the respected elder, but figures whose authority is backed by organized violence and wrapped in ritual. You have symbols, boats, standards, falcons, lions that appear again and again, claiming a cosmos in which order and power are aligned. Later, Egyptian historians will package all of this into neat lists of kings, Dynasty 0 or the followers of Horus, almost mythical figures who ruled before the first officially recognized pharaoh. From our vantage point in the dirt and broken pottery, what we see is less tidy but more interesting. Generations of people experimenting with hierarchy, with territory, with the idea that many villages can be folded into a single political story. This is where the notion of a lost civilization along the Nile stops feeling like fantasy and starts looking like deep prehistory. Not a vanished Atlantis with lasers and forgotten technologies, but a long, layered process of state building that began centuries before Egypt existed as a name. A world where inequality, leadership, and sacred violence were being invented, tested, and refined in mud-brick towns and dusty cemeteries, long before anyone carved a royal cartouche in stone. Soon, one of these competing centers will pull ahead decisively. Its symbols will become the symbols. Its leaders will claim not just a region, but the whole river. And in the monumental tombs they build for themselves, they'll preserve a version of this messy, experimental past that makes it look inevitable. Follow those emerging centers as they grow, and the landscape around them starts to look less like scattered villages and more like something we might cautiously call cities. Take Hierakonpolis, the city of the hawk, in later Egyptian memory. In the Naqada 2 and 3 periods, it's already sprawling across multiple zones: residential areas, craft quarters, ritual spaces, elite cemeteries. Not neatly gridded streets and stone houses, but dense clusters of mud brick buildings, open courtyards, workshops, corrals, smoke from kilns and hearths, bleating animals, the steady thud of pounding grain. On one edge of the settlement, archaeologists have uncovered what looks like an industrial neighborhood. Huge vats and basins lined with mud and sherds suggest large-scale beer production, far beyond what a single household would need. There are specialized workshops for flint knapping, where blades and knives of almost impossibly fine workmanship were mass-produced. Areas with concentrated evidence of pottery firing. This isn't a village where each family does a bit of everything. It's a place where labor is organized and specialized. Not far away, a different kind of space appears. A ceremonial precinct, posts set into the ground in careful arrangements, traces of mud brick walls, and deposits of specially chosen objects. Mace heads carved from exotic stone, figurines, fragments of decorated pallets, and something else, animal burials on a grand scale. At Hierakonpolis, a separate cemetery holds not humans, but powerful beasts: elephants, hippopotamuses, wild cattle, crocodiles, even a leopard, carefully interred, some with grave goods of their own. These are not random kills tossed into a ditch. They look like offerings, trophies, or companions in some elite cult of power. Whoever controlled this place had the resources and manpower to capture, kill, and bury dangerous animals in quantity, turning the mastery of the wild into a visible political statement. Travel north to Tel El Farka in the eastern delta, and you find a different but related story. Here, on what was once an island in the swampy branching channels of the northern Nile, layers of mud brick structures tell of a centre that grew from village to complex hub between about 3,500 and 3000 BCE. There are administrative buildings with multiple rooms and thick walls, storage facilities bursting with jars, and evidence of high-status residences. In one sector, archaeologists found a cluster of small, carefully made cult statues in gold foil and precious materials, hidden away as if in a shrine or treasury. Nearby, the remains of breweries, large installations for making beer on a scale that again suggests public events, feasts, offerings, perhaps rations distributed under elite control. When you see industrial breweries and storage complexes sitting side by side with ritual caches and high-status housing, a pattern emerges. Control over food and drink, especially beer, a safe and calorie-rich staple, is being tied directly to ceremonial life. If you want to participate in the feast, in the festival, in the ritual that keeps the world in order, you do it on terms set by whoever runs these installations. Further south, at Abydos, the landscape splits in two. On the low desert edge are settlement and cult areas. A bit further back from the floodplain, on a higher terrace, cemeteries that will become some of the most important royal burial grounds in early Egypt. By late Naqada, III, and the very beginning of the First Dynasty, Abydos hosts a sequence of large, rectangular tombs made of mud brick and timber. Some are partitioned inside like miniature buildings, with storage chambers, burial chambers, and annexes. Around them cluster dozens, sometimes hundreds, of small subsidiary graves. The main tombs contain stone vessels carved from hard, imported rock, fine pottery with carefully painted motifs, ivory labels and tags that may record deliveries of goods or the names of places under control. The subsidiary graves hold men and women who seem to have been interred at the same time as the central burial, or shortly after. Many researchers think these were retainers, sacrificed or obliged to die to accompany their ruler. Others argue for less dramatic scenarios. Either way, the message is the same. One person's death restructures many other lives. Authority here isn't just about having the biggest house in town. It's about commanding human bodies in life and in death. Inside and around these tombs, another crucial development appears. The earliest royal symbols that later Egyptians will take for granted. On labels, jars, and architectural elements, you start seeing a little rectangular frame with a falcon perched on top. This is the serek, an early way of writing a king's name. The rectangle represents a palace facade with its distinctive recessed panelling. The falcon, almost certainly Horus, sits above, claiming that this building and the person named within it stands under divine protection or embodiment. You also see crowns beginning to differentiate. In some images, a tall white conical crown associated with Upper Egypt. In others, a red, low crown linked to the Delta. Later, these two will be combined into the famous double crown of a unified Egypt, but here we see them as distinct regional emblems, worn by figures in hunting and smiting scenes carved on knife handles and pallets. Boats appear constantly, not just as practical transport, but as symbols of processions and power. On ceremonial pallets, multi-cabined vessels carry standards topped with animals or emblems. Sometimes above or below, bound captives or animals suggest that these are not peaceful pleasure cruises. They're statements. Whoever owns the boats commands movement, trade, and war along the lifeline of the Nile. Animal motifs crowd the iconography. Falcons and vultures, lions and desert dogs, bulls trampling enemies, scorpions, even fantastical composite creatures. They may stand for specific leaders, clans, or deities. They may encode stories we can no longer reconstruct. But their repetition matters. Identity and authority are being wrapped in a bestiary of symbols, each one loaded with associations of speed, ferocity, sky, desert, or fertility. Standing back, you might imagine that this world is laid out for us as clearly as a museum display. Cities, shrines, royal tombs, neat categories, clean lines. The reality is much messier. Most of what we're talking about was built in mud brick and wood, materials that crumble, melt, and vanish under centuries of flood, farming, and rebuilding. The Nile has shifted its course again and again. Floodplains that once held bustling towns are now under meters of alluvium or have been shaved flat by modern agriculture. Later, Egyptians, building their own temples and tombs, quarried older structures for bricks and stone, recycling and erasing at the same time. We know Hierakonpolis, Abydos, Tel El Faka, and a handful of other sites in unusual detail because chance and modern excavation converged there. For every one of these places, there were likely others, pre-dynastic centres whose shrines, breweries, and elite cemeteries have been lost beyond recovery. That's important to keep in mind when we talk about a lost civilization before the pyramids. It's not that there was one single secret culture that disappeared overnight. It's that most of the everyday architecture of this formative world was made of fragile materials in vulnerable locations, then buried, ploughed, or built over by later ages. What survives are the hard things and the special things, stone vessels, ivory tags, fragments of walls in the dry desert fringe, the deep tombs that lay just far enough from the flood to escape obliteration. From those fragments, we infer cities with administrative quarters, breweries tied to shrines, elite residences, and royal tombs that turned one person's death into a public event. Soon, a few of the names on those early Sereks, figures like Narmer and Aha, will step out of this shadowy world and into something closer to history. And when they do, they'll bring their own version of the story, one that smooths over rivals and loose ends and rewrites the origins of Egypt in their image. Imagine living in one of those late Naqada communities as all of this is coming to a head. You know the local great ones by their emblems and estates. You know the shrines where your family has always brought offerings. You know that sometimes men with different standards on their staffs arrive from upriver or downriver, and things get tense for a while. Maybe a skirmish, maybe a new tax, maybe nothing happens at all, just a show of force, and then everyone goes home. From where you stand, politics is a patchwork, power is regional, contested, shifting. From our vantage point, thousands of years later, we give this messy process a single name, unification. Somewhere around the cusp of 3100 BCE, the balance tips. The kings whose tombs rise at Abydos, the rulers whose sereks appear on pots and tags from both Upper Egypt and the Delta, begin to look less like regional bosses and more like something else, monarchs claiming all the Nile as their domain. Later, Egyptians will credit this to one figure. Menes, the first king, the founder, the one who joined Upper and Lower Egypt into a single two lands. Many modern scholars connect that legendary Menes with a real person whose name we can actually see scratched into stone, Narmer. We meet Narmer not in a chronicle or an inscription, but in an object made for ritual display, the Narmer palette. It's a heavy piece of dark stone shaped like an oversized cosmetic palette, carved on both sides with some of the earliest large-scale narrative scenes we know from Egypt. We don't know exactly where it was originally set up, but it ended up in a temple deposit at Hierakonpolis, a kind of sacred archive. On one face, Narmer strides forward, wearing the tall white crown of Upper Egypt. He's about to strike a kneeling enemy with a mace, one hand gripping the captive by the hair. Above, the falcon god Horus perches on a bundle of papyrus stalks, the symbol of the Delta, as if subduing it on the king's behalf. Tiny hieroglyphs spell Narmer's name in a serek right above his head. Flip the palette, and the story shifts. Now, Narmer wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. He inspects rows of decapitated foes. Their heads sit neatly between their legs. Standards topped with animal emblems march in front of him. At the bottom, a mighty bull smashes a walled enclosure and tramples a fallen enemy. It's not a neutral record, it's propaganda of the highest order. Narmer appears larger than everyone else. He wears robes and crowns no ordinary person could touch. The gods hover around him, literalizing what his artists and priests want you to believe, that his victories are cosmic, that his authority flows from the divine, that the union of Upper and Lower Egypt is not just a political accident, but the fulfillment of destiny. And notice something subtle. The palette doesn't show negotiations, marriages, treaties, or messy coalitions. It shows a single man, a single body, single-handedly smiting and inspecting and conquering. That is how early royal ideology works. It takes decades, maybe centuries, of alliances, rivalries, trade links, intermarriages, raids, and shared cults, and compresses them into one clean story. There was division. Then came the king. Now, there is unity. Other evidence from this period points in the same direction. Narmer's name, and the names of closely related rulers like Scorpion and Aha, turn up on ceilings and tags found far apart. Abydos in the south, the Delta in the north, even at trading outposts beyond Egypt's traditional borders. The same Serek, the same royal name, appears on jars that once held oil, wine, grain. Administrative control is stretching like a net along the river, but that net is thrown over an already complex web. The unification didn't conjure kingship out of nowhere. It didn't invent writing or brewing or shrine building or long-distance trade. Those things had deep roots in Naqada culture and in local Delta traditions. What changes now is scale and framing. Local standards become nomes, districts under royal appointees. Regional deities are folded into a national pantheon, with the king as their mediator. Older fortified estates and cult centres become nodes in a single royal system. From the palace view, though, all of that is rebranded as a beginning. Later, king lists, carved on temple walls in the New Kingdom, will start with a short string of shadowy pre-dynastic rulers, and then settle into a confident sequence. Dynasty 1, Dynasty 2, and so on, as if you could draw a clean line in the sand between before and after. They name Abydos kings like Narmer and Aha, but they place them at the start of a story whose climax is the great pyramid builders, and whose hero is the continuous institution of kingship itself. In the process, the richness of what came before gets compressed. Those independent centres in the Delta with their own gold-covered figurines and breweries, they become lower Egyptian towns that needed to be tamed. The animal cults and elite cemeteries at Hierakonpolis, background to the rise of Horus, lord of Nekhen, an early chapter leading inevitably to the unified throne. Other regional traditions that didn't make it into the royal canon may vanish from memory entirely. None of this was necessarily a deliberate cover-up. It's what states do when they solidify, they simplify. They prefer a single founding moment to 100 overlapping experiments. They remember the winners' lineages and let the cousins and rivals fade into myth or into nothing at all. So when we talk about Egypt being unified under Narmer or his peers, we're looking at two different layers at once. On the ground, a gradual knitting together of riverine chiefdoms, trading networks, and sacred landscapes that had been evolving for centuries. On the monuments, a sudden, almost theatrical appearance of kings who claim to have brought order out of chaos, the two lands out of two warring halves, history out of prehistory. Between those two layers, between lived complexity and official story, whole ways of being Egyptian could slip into the cracks and be lost. When later Egyptians looked back, they saw a clean beginning. The first kings, the first dynasties, the first real monuments. From our perspective, that's already a kind of erasure. But even if they had wanted to remember every detail of what came before, the Nile itself would have made that almost impossible. Think about where those earliest farming villages and river camps actually sat, not up on the high desert where the royal cemeteries are. Right down on the floodplain, close to the water, where the soil was rich and irrigation easiest. That floodplain is not stable ground. Each year, in the millennia before big dams, the Nile rose and spilled over its banks. The water slowed, spread out, and dropped its load of fine silt. That's what made Egypt fertile in the first place. It also meant that anything flimsy left on the surface tended to get buried, smeared, or washed away. A cluster of houses made of mud and plant matter, a wooden shrine, a fence line. Leave it for a few seasons with no one patching the cracks or rebuilding the walls, and the river will slowly unmake it. Add a century or 5, and it doesn't just crumble, it disappears into new fields, new channels, new layers of mud. Archaeologists sometimes talk about taphonomy, the study of how things decay. In the Nile Valley, the taphonomy of ordinary life is brutal. Pre-dynastic people built with what they had at hand: mud brick, reeds, timber, packed earth. You can raise a village with those materials. You can't count on it being readable 5,000 years later, especially if later generations come along and build on the same spot. Stone is different. A cut limestone block, a granite slab with a carved name, will hold its shape through floods that erase 10 villages. That's one reason the beginning of Egyptian history looks so sharp in the record. The Old Kingdom pyramids and stone temples are much easier to find, date, and admire than a cluster of obliterated Naqada huts under 10 meters of alluvium. So the farther back you go, the more the balance shifts. Everyday life becomes fragile, patchy, elusive. Elite tombs and special deposits, things intentionally placed in dry, high places, start to dominate what survives. Look at Abydos. The earliest royal tombs there are already built on the desert edge, above the reach of most floods. The graves of powerful Naqada chiefs at Heracompolis and Naqada itself occupy similar zones. Though survive far better than the living settlements on the low ground that fed them, this creates a distortion. We end up with a prehistory that looks like a chain of graves and cult centres, as if people spent most of their energy on burial and ritual. The breweries, storage pits, workshops, and clustered houses that made those elites possible, many are gone, shredded by water, ploughed under by later farmers, or simply lying too deep beneath modern villages for anyone to excavate. Then, add another force. Egyptians themselves were great recyclers. Once big stone building becomes normal, you don't always quarry fresh. You look around. An old temple block with a nice flat face and a half-erased inscription is a perfect candidate for a new wall. A broken statue makes good fill under a courtyard. Mud brick from a decayed enclosure can be scooped up, re-wetted, and turned into new bricks. Sacred geography also repeats. A place that is holy in 3500 BCE tends to stay holy in 2500, in 1500, in 500. New shrines rise where old ones stood. A First Dynasty enclosure is overlapped by a Middle Kingdom chapel, then capped by a late period temple, then buried under a Coptic church or a modern town. Every time that happens, older layers get chopped, reused, or locked under foundations. Hierakonpolis, Naqada, and Buto all show this palimpsest effect, centuries of rebuilding on the same sacred and political nodes. By the time we arrive with trowels and notebooks, what's left of the earliest phases may be a scatter of potsherds under deeper, later ruins. On top of that comes looting. Not just modern tomb robbing, although that's a huge problem, but thousands of years of people digging where they suspect valuables lie. Graves are obvious targets. They're discrete, bounded deposits, often marked, sometimes monumental. An elite burial is like a concentrated time capsule of fine goods: gold foil, stone vessels, imported jars. Pre-dynastic cemeteries were disturbed in antiquity, and again in the 19th and 20th centuries. Each intrusion removes objects, mixes layers, blurs fine details. Houses, by contrast, are low reward. No one raids an old floor for jewellery that probably wasn't there to begin with. So paradoxically, tombs survive as attention magnets, better documented, more explored, while the texture of daily life stays ghostly. Put all of this together, and erasure starts to look less like a single event and more like an accumulation of biases. The river favours high, dry, and durable. The state favours kings and temples. Looters favour rich graves. Later builders favour old sacred spots. Historians working with what's left end up telling stories that overemphasize rulers, stone, and desert, and underrepresent farmers, mud, and floodplain. That doesn't mean the earlier Nile cultures were truly wiped from history. Their genetic lines flow into later Egyptians. Their gods leave faint fingerprints in later myths. Their pottery styles echo in later ceramics. Their villages may still lie under your feet if you stand in a delta field or a modern Nile-side town. What's been erased is their visibility. They've slipped below the threshold where they can easily be seen, named, and narrated. Their world is there in fragments and sediments, but it takes careful excavation and a willingness to read past what the kings wanted remembered to bring even a little of it back into view. When you stand in that fog of partial evidence, it's tempting to clear it with a single big story. For Egypt, one of the most popular big stories goes like this. The reason the earliest phases look so fragmentary, the reason civilization seems to appear suddenly, is because we're missing an entire chapter. A lost super-civilization, hyper-advanced builders who came before the pharaohs, maybe before the last ice age, who taught the Egyptians everything and then vanished. You've probably heard versions of it. The pyramids are too precise for stone tools. The Sphinx is much older than dynastic Egypt. Flood myths and first-time legends are actually dim memories of this vanished world. Maybe the teachers were survivors from Atlantis. Maybe they were visitors from somewhere even farther away. It's a compelling narrative. It makes the gaps feel intentional, like torn-out pages instead of the normal mess of archaeology. It flatters us too. If the truth is so extraordinary that they had to erase it, then decoding it makes you part of a chosen few who see beyond the official story. But let's walk slowly through what we actually have. The ground reality in Egypt is not a neat break between nothing and pyramids. It's a very long, very human ramp. We can trace pottery styles changing gradually over millennia. We can see house forms evolve from simple huts to more organized compounds. We can follow tombs as they lengthen, deepen, gain side chambers, adopt new grave goods. We see early mace heads with simple decoration give way to elaborately carved ones showing warfare and kingship. We can watch stone working move from rough hand axes to finely polished vessels to large, well-fitted limestone blocks. There are no rogue granite megablocks from 10,000 years earlier, no precision-cut cores from vanished skyscrapers, no layer of industrial debris sitting under Naqada culture. The tools we find in the earliest sites are exactly what you'd expect for late Stone Age farmers and herders. Flint blades, grindstones, bone awls, not alien alloys. When early experiments with stone architecture start to appear, they're messy. The first step pyramids are modifications of mastaba tombs. Walls lean, crack, get rebuilt. The learning curve is visible. If you had a super civilization tutoring you, you'd expect fewer false starts. Archaeologists are not hiding some extra set of data that proves otherwise. Many would love a dramatic find. Entire careers are made on "this doesn't fit what we thought." The consensus view doesn't come from a lack of imagination. It comes from decades of slow accumulation, radiocarbon dates, stratigraphy, microscopic wear on tools, stable isotope analysis of bones, the chemistry of ancient plasters and mortars. So why do so many people still feel that something is missing? Part of it is that the Egyptians themselves insisted there was a time before time. They talked about a first occasion, a golden age when the gods ruled on earth. Lists from much later periods name semi-mythical rulers, divine kings, then followers of Horus, reigning for impossibly long spans. Priests in Greek and Roman times would point to ruined sanctuaries and say, "This is from before the first dynasty," loading those stones with enormous antiquity. It sounds like exactly what you'd expect if memories of an earlier, greater civilization had survived as myth. But this is where we have to be careful. Myth can store bits of historical truth, but it doesn't do so like a hard drive. It compresses, exaggerates, folds events into symbols. Every culture with kings tends to imagine a time when kingship came from the gods. Long reigns, perfect justice, cosmic harmony. The deeper you go into the past, the more you're in the realm of ought rather than was. When Egyptian texts say a god ruled for thousands of years, they aren't giving you a literal regnal list. They're asserting that order itself is older than any human lineage. Even the followers of Horus may be doing something like what we do when we say the Founding Fathers. It's a blurry, idealized category, not a tight, verifiable sequence of individuals. Some scholars see in those names a distorted memory of pre-dynastic chieftains. Others see a purely theological construct. The evidence is too thin to be sure. And that thinness is exactly where speculative theories thrive. There really are missing settlements. We know they existed from cemeteries and trash layers, but the houses themselves are gone, or buried too deep, or lie under modern towns. There really are regional gaps. Upper Egypt has yielded a rich pre-dynastic record. Big parts of the delta, where people certainly lived, are archaeologically underexplored because groundwater and modern development make excavation hard. There really are puzzles. Why do some symbols appear fully formed? Why did certain technologies spread so rapidly at specific moments? Why do elaborate ceremonial palettes and elite tombs appear when the population overall is still small? You can answer those with processes we understand from other places. Innovation in one region, trade networks carrying ideas as much as goods, status competition among chiefs, religious shifts that favour certain display forms, or you can answer them with external civilizers stepping in to jumpstart complexity. The first set of explanations is slower, less cinematic. It also lines up with what we see in Mesopotamia, the Indus, the Andes, Mesoamerica, places that developed monumental architecture and complex states without any need to invoke Atlanteans. That doesn't mean we have everything nailed down. We don't. The dating of some monuments is still debated. The original appearance and meaning of certain symbols, like the earliest forms of the falcon of Horus, or the strange half-animal, half-standard figures on pre-dynastic art, are not fully understood. There may be villages, shrines, even modest stone structures we haven't found yet, sitting under farms or apartment blocks or Nile mud. Leaving room for that unknown doesn't require imagining anti-gravity devices in 3000 BCE. The real story is already astonishing. In 3,000 or 4,000 years, Nile foragers and fishers turned into farmers, then into villagers, then into city builders and kings. They learned the moods of a wild river, organized labor on a massive scale, encoded their understanding of the cosmos into temple ground plans and burial customs. They did it with stone and mud, wood and cord, observation and memory, no secret blueprints, no lost super race whispering in their ears. What we're left with is a record that is detailed in places, hazy in others, torn and overwritten almost everywhere. In that patchwork, myths of primeval gods and half-remembered rulers sit next to pottery typologies and pollen samples. Fringe theories rush to fill the blank spaces with certainty. Archaeology does something stranger. It lets the blank stay blank for now, and still finds wonder in what's actually there. So when we step back from the fog and look at what actually survived, what do we see? We see that by the time the first pyramid stones were laid, Egypt had already been a land of villages and chiefs, traders and craftsmen, ritual specialists and regional kings for thousands of years. We have cemeteries at sites like Naqada, Abydos, Hierakonpolis, full of carefully arranged burials, grave goods that mark status, imported luxury items from far-off lands. We have town plans and storage facilities, breweries, workshops, animal cult centres. We have rock carvings of boats and processions, early royal names inscribed on stone, palettes showing organised warfare, and hierarchies of captives and conquerors. We have radiocarbon dates that push organised communities back into the 5th and even 6th millennium BCE. We have DNA and isotope studies showing population continuity from pre-dynastic people into the first dynasties. We have the same motifs: falcons, boats, sarek frames, crowns, evolving, not appearing from nowhere. That deeper story isn't one lost empire erased overnight. It's layers, seasonal camps becoming hamlets, hamlets becoming towns, towns becoming proto-cities, each with its own gods and ancestor cults and symbols of authority. When Nama and his successors knit those regions together, they didn't wipe the slate clean. They repainted it. Local deities were promoted into major gods. Old shrines were rebuilt in stone. Early kings were folded into divine genealogies. The pyramids are what most people remember. But beneath them is an older inheritance, the farmers who first tamed floodwater into fields, the potters who figured out firing techniques, the weavers, brewers, flint knappers, boat builders, the anonymous officials who learned how to count grain and calculate rations. Their names rarely made it into inscriptions, but their systems did. The state that built Giza runs on pre-dynastic software, and we almost certainly haven't found it all. Every year, a new survey with ground-penetrating radar hints at buried walls under village streets. A construction project turns up a foundation trench where nobody expected a building. A shift in the Nile's course is modelled, and suddenly a blank area on the map looks like prime real estate for a 6,000-year-old harbour. Under delta fields, beneath apartment blocks, beneath metres of wind-blown sand and Nile silt, there are almost certainly more chapters of this story waiting. More small shrines in mud brick, more boat burials, more layers that show how memory was stitched from earlier lives. The legend of Egypt, gods, pyramids, golden masks, is real, but it's the visible crest of a much older wave. The people who raised the first colossal tombs were standing on the shoulders of hundreds of generations, whose traces now fit on potsherds and broken beads. If you'd like to go deeper into that buried world, help this kind of content reach more people. Please tap like, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who only knows Egypt as pyramids and pharaohs. And I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and which layer of Egypt's story you'd most want archaeologists to uncover next.